Okay. And let's plan for both of you to have about a half an hour and then maybe 15 minutes of discussion to pull everything together at the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, just let me know if I'm like running over or something, because sometimes I'm bad with my time management. Okay. I'm also not the best with like Zoom and stuff.
I have to talk to myself when I go in and out just to keep myself straight. So feel free.
Okay. Is it working? Is it all?
We can see it. You got it.
Cool. Awesome. So I had the beginning half of chapter 5, which was who are the fat talkers. I just wanted to start off like with this quote, which says, continue to embrace the things that make you unique, even if it makes others feel uncomfortable. You are enough. And whenever you're feeling doubt, whenever you want to give up, you must always remember to choose freedom over fear, which was by Janelle Monáe, sorry, who I love her. And so it kind of just encompasses everything that we're about to talk about in this chapter. So the chapter starts off with this first study that kind of concludes that fat talk was a gendered phenomenon, which we saw it a lot more in girls or females than we would in males. And then it talks about this psychology of size survey. So they gave participants, men and women, 3 scenarios: a negative scenario, a self-accepting scenario, and a positive scenario. And people were to rate it like frequently or not frequently or never, that type of scale, if they had heard fat talk before, and if they heard these situations before, and also if they would feel pressure to engage in these type of situations. So no gender differences were found in scenarios 2 and 3 for the self-accepting and the positive body talk ones. But then there's a big discrepancy in men and women for the negative or fat talk situation, where 73.6% of women found that they frequently hear fat talk compared to 26.4% of men. And then 71.9% of women feel pressured to engage in fat talk compared to 28.1% of men. And so I kind of wanted to start off with the first question of like, why do you guys think this is? And I can kind of start off like, I kind of thought maybe it would go off like what we've talked about in other presentations, like societal standards, like girls like are all the time are thought to be, they need to be thin and they need to be this and they need to be that. Whereas men, like there's kind of this like dad bod fad and other like body types that are like accepted for them. So I kind of just wanted to like ask you guys like what you guys thought on the discrepancy between men and women.
I mentioned this in one of my reflections, but I found, like, especially since we started talking about fat talk, that I actually see it a lot more in like advertisements directed towards women, even on like websites or on social media, like getting targeted ads for like weight loss stuff, because I guess my research history shows that I'm a woman, or I was looking at like women's clothing or whatever. So it's like, even in that way, I feel like women are often more targeted for things that would like make you second guess and maybe even like promote fat talk.
Vivian, can you give us an example of an ad?
I can't remember like the brands off the top of my head. Some of them were just like clickbait. They were like, lose 25 to 30 pounds in 10 days with this new diet trend or whatever, like that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I've seen a lot of like ads for razors for women and like exclusively towards women. And like we've talked about pink tax before, and they're always really expensive. Like the idea that you can't have any body hair and like that kind of thing.
Knowing that the body image is one of the strongest gender differences in the whole field of psychology, is the fat talk surprising? The differences in the fat talk between men and women surprising?
Yeah, I personally didn't find it super surprising. Like I would have definitely guessed that the numbers would be skewed that way. And I just think in general, like I have a decent amount of guy friends and I rarely hear them ever talk about like their bodies or themselves or this and that. Even if they do go to the gym, and it's never like, oh, I need to go to the gym or I'm looking this way or that way. They're just like, it's kind of like how they hang out. They just go to the gym. Yeah. Okay, so moving on. So then a similar study was done also in the UK, which I thought was very interesting, and it found pretty much the same numbers. So it was saying that, like in conclusion, that fat talk could be cross-cultural. And this also wasn't very surprising to me because I think social media is just so broad nowadays that women our age are probably seeing the same things in UK, like on like social media and whatnot that we're seeing here. And so they're probably getting the same advertisements and this and that and stuff. So they're probably feeling the same type of societal pressures. So that was kind of my thought to that. Yeah. So then the next section of the chapter was racial influences on fat talk. So there was one study done with 157 Caucasian women, and they were given a scenario to read. And where people were engaging in fat talk, and the name Ava was used because it was found that it was equal across Caucasian and African American women, like it could be equal in both races, the name used. And so she was either given the race of Caucasian, African American, or no race specified at all. And so when her race was not specified, 97.8% of people thought that she would be Caucasian. And so the book, and also I wanted to like raise this question to you guys of, do you think that Caucasian women feel that fat talk is more normative for themselves, or that they just can't picture African American women doing so or engaging in this type of dialogue? Another point I did want to bring up for like when asking this question is this study and the study I'm about to talk about afterwards were both done in I think it was like South and Southeastern colleges. And so like just using our university as an example, I know it's a predominantly like Caucasian school or Caucasian population. And so I didn't know if that would maybe affect it, because knowing me, like I am a Caucasian woman and most of my friends are going to this university. And so like when putting these themselves in that scenario, they might just think about themselves and their friends. And that's why they maybe thought that Ava was that race opposed to being African American. That was kind of my thoughts maybe on the study.
So I actually wrote about this in one of my reflections, but I looked up the history behind fat phobia, and I found Sabrina Springs, who talks about the racial history of fat phobia. And one of the parts of the racial history of fat phobia is it was a very white European thing to make an in group and an out group. So it's not actually a part of the African American culture. It was a way of being like, we can handle limiting what we eat, and we can like we're superior because we can be skinny because we don't eat a whole bunch, because like, and this is like something that she found in actually like tabloids and like newspapers back in like the 1800s and stuff, of like it really starting to specifically target European women. And it was to create these two racially specific cultures. And it was a way too that has affected the Black community since then because of fat phobia and the medical industry kind of taking on this idea of like, if you're fat, that's why you have these health conditions. And so it's definitely had a lasting impact. But I think that plays a role into all of this of why we don't hear Black women participate in it as much, is because they're way more accepting of larger body types. And part of it's because it's been their culture forever, and we created this fat phobia culture. So I just found that really surprising because I didn't really know about it. And I found it very insightful for the cultural differences.
Yeah. And honestly, it's very interesting that you say that, because like going off to the next like study, it kind of comes to the conclusion um of like exactly what you just said, how like African American women do not have like that like ideal like thin like body type like at all, and it was definitely like created like you said. So in the next study they had two different groups of Caucasian women and then African American women, and they were asked what they thought their own ideal like beauty standards were, and then what they thought the other group's ideal body standards were. And so African American women thought that the Caucasian ideal role models were thin and almost sickly looking, and that their use of fat talk contributed to their body dissatisfaction, while Caucasian women stated that that their ideal was a thin yet curvy athletic body. And I just thought that this was very interesting because it's like kind of going off like what you said, like like those women, they're like, or African American women are looking at white women who want like this thin, super ideal body type. But then African American women, they stated, it was really interesting actually, they stated that their ideal body type was very individualized. And that's where this quote came from. It's like, make what you have work for you, which I thought is like an amazing way to look at any type of body type, like what you have work, like make it work for you. And I kind of wanted to ask the question too of like why we thought that there was like this huge like discrepancy and like just different races of like body type and beauty standards. And kind of what my mind went to when I was thinking about this and asking myself this question was young girls, like we look up to like models and these supermodels and this and that, and they're all like insanely thin looking. And so just out of curiosity, I looked up when the first African-American woman was to walk in the Victoria's Secret fashion show, because in my mind, that's like the very super thin ideal. And there was a lot of discrepancy and debate on it. But what I could find was that it was Tyra Banks in the late 1990s, but she still fits this very thin supermodel ideal. And I kind of thought it was funny that she even represents a life-sized Barbie in that movie, Life Size. And so I was just thinking, like, as young, like Caucasian girls, we're looking up to these like thin, like white supermodels all the time. And young, like African-American women, they didn't really have that representation in the beauty industry until recently. And so they're just like not looking up to like people of their race or their color, like in these like super high end, like beauty industry things. And so that's kind of where my mind went to, but I kind of wanted to ask like why you guys like also thought kind of what Jama said before, but why you thought there was just such a huge like discrepancy between the races and their ideal like body sizes or body images.
You do see in the United States in marginal individuals that come from marginalized groups, there tends to be culturally the way people are raised in the family, more self-love and promotion of esteem and that type of thing. This idea that all these other people are trying to keep us down. And so there's a little bit more of a like, we're gonna like pick one another up and support one another and kind of house that self-esteem. And I saw some of you all writing about that in your reflection papers, particularly those of you who had friends of different races and how you felt like their parents treated them, how your parents treated you all. And it seemed like there was a little bit of that, a little more critique in white families, more esteem and respect and love in individuals of color in those families.
Oh, Sophie put something in the chat.
She's trying to talk, but her microphone's not working.
Yeah, and actually going off what Sophie said is what I wrote about in my reflection about how for like the longest time Barbie was like this white thin ideal, and also like with models, like for the longest time they were just like this white thin ideal. And so I think that that's why possibly there could be this like race disparity in beauty and body images. Okay, so going to the next slide, it's how age seems to affect fat talk. Sorry. And so there was a few studies done. Some found like no correlation at all between age and fat talk, and then some found a small negative correlation. So as people got older, they seemed that fat talk decreased a little bit. And so I kind of wanted to like just talk about it a little bit, like why you guys think this is. And I kind of thought, you know, it was mainly due to the fact of social media being like a really like new generational thing. I mean, my mom didn't even get Facebook until the last like 3 or 4 years. So I just don't think she's really like seeing what we see and getting the ads that we get and stuff like that. So I think that maybe that's why it was found that like older generations don't necessarily talk about fat talk as much, but I kind of wanted to see like what you guys thought and why you would think that would be.
I think that like older generations definitely don't have the same like elements of fat talk, but I think that like the generation above us, like our parents that grew up in like the 80s and then in the 90s, especially in like early 2000s, have like really bad body image issues. From like what I've seen, like I know my mom and like my friends' moms, like they all like are obsessed with like diet culture and stuff like that because it like blew up in the 90s and like early 2000s.
I would agree with Sydney because one thing that I realized is like, yeah, my grandma doesn't really care, but my mom, that's like the first introduction that I had to fat talk, is because like I constantly heard her talking bad about her body. And I think that's what made me realize at a young age, like, oh, I want to learn how to love myself because like I don't want to have this view. And so I think it depends maybe on the generation, and maybe that's has to do with media or advertisements. I'm not quite sure, but I think to an extent there may be a negative correlation, but I think that's also why they couldn't find a correlation is because it depends on the generations.
Yeah, I agree. I think it definitely depends on the generation because I think if they were to do this study in like 20, 30 years when we're like an older generation, we would still probably engage in fat talk just as much just because of the society like we kind of grew up in or like the things we've been exposed to. And I agree, like my grandparents' generation, I don't really see my grandma like talking about that stuff like as much at all. And so I think it's definitely like becoming a more prevalent thing. And I think that like the generations now are going to probably carry that into like older stages of life as well.
And in
Yeah,
historically, I think about the Great Depression too, and that's probably your great great grandparents, I would think, who lived through that. But there's still some effects of the Great Depression generationally, and it was like if you've got food, that's fantastic, you know, because a lot of people could not afford food, and a lot of people starved during that time in our history. Somebody
and
was about to speak, sorry.
oh no, it kind of goes off of that. Like I don't know if your grandparents say this, but I know my grandparents are always worried because they're like, you're too skinny and like that type of deal. So like they're the exact opposite. So maybe that's why as it comes from the Great Depression mentality.
Yeah. And Sophie said something in the chat about how like it's a generational thing that maybe like because she's a CNA, people just as they get older, they just kind of like don't care anymore. They're just kind of like they're older, they're at like the end of their life. They're just like what they look like is probably like kind of last thing on their mind at that point, which like I kind of agree. It's probably not super like a necessary thing for them to discuss or talk about at the time.
And
Oh, go ahead.
in general, women, as they go through midlife and age, tend to acquire more self-esteem over time and care less about things that when you're younger feel very important. And when you get older, it's like, why did I worry about that? Why did I fret over those things? So some of that could be that effect that occurs across the lifespan too. Okay.
Okay, so the next little section was comparing body size and fat talk. And there's a few studies done where there was like no correlation or no like difference between like different body sizes and fat talk. But then there was one international sample that found that overweight but not obese women engaged in the most amount of fat talk. And then people who were in normal weight, like normal weight category for BMI, did the least amount. And they found this because women reported their height and weight so they could correlate their BMI with the amount that they heard and also participated in fat talk. And then there was also one study that found a positive correlation. So as BMI increased, also the amount of fat talk increased. So I kind of wanted to ask like if we found this surprising or not. When I first read this, I kind of found it a little bit surprising, but then I was thinking back to, I'm not exactly sure what chapter it was, but a few chapters ago when we discussed like the different types of fat talk. And I remember one of them being like, sometimes when people have gained weight or they feel that they're bigger, like by societal standards, that they feel kind of guilty. And so that's kind of why they engage in fat talk. And so I didn't know if like, maybe that's what like this came from as well with people who were in the overweight category for BMI, why they were engaging in fat talk more so than people who were underweight or of normal weight. I just wanted to like see what you guys thought.
And the research has found a difference between that relationship between larger individuals and more fat talk if the fat talk is already ongoing in conversation.
The survey, sorry, I didn't mention that, but the survey said that like fat talk was already present when they were surveyed.
Yeah. And why do you think people would feel pressure to fat talk in that occasion?
I think like someone's more overweight, but their friend that's underweight or average weight is fat talking, they might feel like they should also, like, if you're bigger than someone else, it's like, well, I definitely need to be fat talking then if someone smaller than me is. That kind of, you have to like join in mentality.
Do you think the science shows that larger women initiate fat talk in conversations? And that's a no, like not starting it, but then when it kind of like what Emma just said, when it's happening, feeling this pressure to join in, particularly if they've already kind of sized up body sizes of people that they're talking with.
Yeah, that was kind of what my thought like kind of was too. It's like they like, I guess like guilt isn't like the best word to use, but kind of like they feel like they're like, oh, like they know like they're a little bit bigger and stuff like that. So like by societal standards. And so like they're like kind of like guilted into being like pressured into like talking about it and stuff like that. That was kind of my thought process behind it. Okay. Okay, so then nobody else has anything to add. We'll go to the next one, which was the relationship between eating disorders and fat talk. So this first study done, they surveyed men and women to find the correlation between eating disorders and fat talk. And so they found a positive correlation in both men and women, but it was higher in women. And the three things they were looking at was the revised restraint scale for concern for dieting, and then the eating disorders inventory drive for thinness, and then also the bulimia subscale. So with all of those things, there was all positive correlation, but then it was high, it was seen to be more so in women. And I kind of wanted to ask, like, why do you think that it is? And I kind of thought, like, as we talked about before, there's eating disorders are more prevalent in women, like when talking about like anorexia and bulimia, they're more prevalent. So maybe just when doing this study or something, these people like reported hearing fat talk and stuff more just because they were more exposed to being or to having an eating disorder. But I kind of wanted to see what you guys thought about like the difference between eating disorder and fat talk. And I kind of thought about too, kind of like I said on the last slide, kind of like the guilt thing where it's like, oh, if they like have an eating disorder, they feel almost more pressured to like talk about fat talk or something like that. But I wasn't necessarily sure.
It's interesting that you don't tend to see in other types of mental health concerns, people vocalizing their mental health concerns quite like you see with the eating disorder, vocalizing it in the fat talk, which kind of speaks to just how normative it is, you know? But it breaks from other types of psychological issues in that regards.
And then there was another study done that was kind of like the same thing, but it was called the 2002 Weight Management, Eating and Exercise Habits Survey. And that people with eating disorders, they reported participating in fat talk at least daily, and people without eating disorders rarely or never participated in fat talk. And they also reported that the dialogue of that surrounded fat talk or the commentary was on other people's physical appearance. And so for me, this was like a little bit surprising that it would be on other people's physical appearance, because like we just talked about in the last slide, like that people who are considered overweight or obese and they're engaging in fat talk, it's because like they themselves like feel a little bit guilty, or they see the people around them, and that's why they engage in this type of discussion. But it was interesting to me that the commentary was normally on other people's physical appearance opposed to maybe like bringing it back on themselves. But I didn't know if anyone else found this surprising.
What's the other construct that we've talked about that is common in people who fat talk a lot, is common in people with eating disorders, that could be like a third variable that would explain this? What about the social comparison? That individuals with body image issues, with eating disorders are doing a lot of that social comparison, and that's what's leaking out when they're talking about other people's physical appearance. Does that make some sense to y'all?
Yeah. And then it's actually kind of funny you say that, because then this is the last slide, but the social comparison, it's actually the last bullet point, but this section talked about the upward appearance comparison and the downward appearance comparison. And like upwards appearance comparison is when like you compare yourself to someone who you view as prettier than you, and downwards appearance comparison is someone like you're comparing yourself who someone you view as like not as pretty as you, or like your look better than, or something like that. And so it was like kind of viewed as like a coping mechanism, and like Dr. March said, like the social comparison like aspect of it all. But studies found that when people use this, that they are more likely to have body dissatisfaction, drive for thinness, dietary restraints, and they engage in fat talk more frequently. So even though people use this to maybe like try to feel better about themselves or try to cope with things, in the end, it just turns out that like it's causing all these actually like really negative effects. But in the nature of fat talk, there was a few studies done, and it also showed that participating in fat talk was directly related to perceived pressure to be thin, as well as depression. And so there was also a study done, it was called the ecological momentary assessment, and they thought that this was like a lot more of like a clever way to do things. It wasn't like giving people like a scenario to respond to. So what they actually did is, over the course, I think it was 5 days, it was like between 8 and like 11 p.m. And they were like to randomly respond 25 times if they had heard fat talk in like the recent like history of them like talking to their friends and stuff. And 96.9, so almost 97%, reported at least one episode of fat talk, and an average of 10 episodes in 5 days. And every single time that these like fat talk scenarios were reported, they were all related to negative emotions. And so then when people were interviewed kind of at the end of this study, a lot of them were like, wow, like I didn't realize how much like me and my friends talked about this, or how this actually negatively affected me. And so, and then the book also related that to like how we've all kind of been feeling about when we've been talking about this and presenting. We're like, wow, like I didn't realize how much me or my mom or my friends like talked about this. And I've just, at least personally, I've tried to be a little bit more aware of when these thoughts pop into my head and stuff like that. So I kind of wanted to ask the question, like would an intervention that brings to light the exposure to fat talk just in general help reduce it? Because I know for me, I didn't realize how much that this was like kind of a problem for me and my friends and my family members. But once like we started talking about it in this class and people were presenting and stuff like that, I realized how common it was in my daily life. And so now I've tried to, when those thoughts pop in my head, be like, no, like don't not think about it. And even me and my roommates have talked about it, and they're like, wow, that's really interesting and stuff. So I wanted to see if like you guys thought if just like an intervention with girls like around our age or even younger would help possibly reduce the amount of fat talk that we see daily.
We don't have a tri-delts here at ASU, but they oftentimes at sorority, and it's usually in the spring, will do a fat talk free week, where just the sorority members intentionally let go of that for a week. But it's interesting, after fat talk free week, a lot of them report having reduced their fat talk compared to pre fat talk free week. And I think it's the same kind of thing that a lot of people are doing on their reflections in this class, that once you realize you're participating, a lot of times you want to try to figure out how not to participate as much. Any other thoughts on what would help? What would be an intervention that would help people reduce their fat talk?
For me, just like when reading the chapters and seeing like the percentages of, or just like the results in a lot of studies and surveys, seeing that girls who engage in fat talk are more likely to be depressed or develop eating disorders, or just like be like have a lot of body dissatisfaction. Just in me, like seeing all those like almost negative side effects of fat talk, it's like for me, I'm like, wow, I need to really like try to like not have those thoughts and not engage in this type of discussion, because I don't want to like I just don't want those like negative, like I don't even know if side effects is the right word, but like those negative side effects from like having stuff like that.
Any other thoughts on what would help people who wanted to change this, change this?
I think that we should start with like young girls, in like schools and stuff, because so we know like the BMI ratio, whatever, is like super outdated and like not used anymore. But I remember being in elementary school and we had a day in PE where they like took our heights and weights and whatever else is incorporated into it. And then they handed each of us like a slip of paper that said like normal weight, underweight, overweight, obese, whatever. And I got obese and I was like 8. And which is crazy because I am not obese. I'm like a very normal weight. And I was back then, I was just like really tall and like bigger for like a fourth grader, third grader, whatever. And that like, I still remember that like to this day being like, oh my God, like I didn't want to like show it to any of my friends or whatever. And that like affected me like throughout high school. And even now, like I still remember it very clearly. And so like, I think if we stop like talking about bodies in that sense when we're like really, really young, that it will like help girls in the future. And if you just like encourage like healthy eating and like healthy like living instead of like healthy to lose weight, it would like make a big difference in like girls when they grow up.
I agree. And I also think this, like going back to a few slides ago, like the like make what you have work or work what you have, whatever it was. Like I just think that that should just be like reiterated over and over again, because like as we know, like different clothes are going to look so good on other people and just not look right on others, and like vice versa. And I just think that everyone should just kind of like own what they have, and like that's just like one of the best ways like to look at like everything.
I think also going off what Sydney was saying is like better nutrition classes of just like emphasizing rather than weight, but emphasizing how beneficial nutrition exercises can be to everyone, especially as we're young. So I don't know if they add it. Like I know that we do have a nutrition class now, but I don't think it's adequately portrayed in the nutrition classes. I think I learned more about it in college than I did in like grade school. About like how important it is to exercise and how it like lowers like cancer and all that stuff. Because I think they focus so much on weight in our nutrition class, even now, about obese and overweight. Because I know that we had to watch Super Size Me so many times. And I think just like a more body positive approach of being like, if someone says something negative about their body, instead of responding this way, maybe respond with like giving them comfort or like reassuring them rather than insulting ourselves in the process. So maybe those type of interventions too.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely a good point. And also I agree, like I was thinking about it when you were talking, like I don't even think I had a health class until like 6th or 7th grade, which is like kind of old if you think about it. Like people are already like gone through puberty and stuff at that point. So like I think it would definitely be more beneficial to start having like more nutrition classes and like body positive talk and stuff like that at like grade school, like even like 2nd, 3rd grade, something like that, like before like it can get like really like bad or negative. But that was pretty much all I had, I'm pretty sure, unless anybody else wanted to add anything else.
Thank
Awesome.
you, Allison. You can go ahead and unshare. And Madison, I'm looking for you.
Here.
There you are. Hey. Are you ready to screen share? And do
I am. Let's see if
Right.
I can do this. I am not technologically advanced.
the learning curve? I was so anxious last March when we had to go online. And I was away and I was just really anxious to get back and like figure out how to do things and do the online. It was definitely a learning curve, but
Okay, can you guys see this?
we can.
All right, cool. Just wanted to make sure. So the first section of the last part of the chapter that I did was on men's body talk, which is considered less common than women's body talk. But I think that from what I saw from the percentages, it's actually, they're very similar in terms of how often men and women hear fat talk. I think it's each like 26 to 28%, which I thought was really interesting. But men's body talk is more centered around musculature and the appearance of arms and abs. So, you know, 6-packs and the size of biceps and things like that, compared to like fat content. Although men do still talk about like
you know, I have a beer belly and things like that. So it's still common, but it's not as common as talking about muscularity. And some of the risk factors talked about in the book was sexual orientation. So homosexual men tend to engage more in body talk because they feel like they have to fit in more with a certain like stereotype. So, you know, homosexual men are typically seen as more aesthetically pleasing and, you know, have more sense of style and that kind of thing. And also from the Chow and Tan study from 2016, they looked at friendship pairs, and men who have friends with lower body mass indices tend to engage in more body talk and have more body dissatisfaction, which makes a lot of sense if we think about even for women. You know, you have smaller friends, you tend to engage more in body talk, especially because, as we talked about, they tend to start that body talk, and then bigger women tend to follow that just to kind of ease the pressure off of them a little bit. And one of the questions that I wanted to ask, because I don't really know if there's a lot of research on this, for men who consider themselves to be bisexual, or even just men who tend to, you know, like more than one gender, do they feel more pressure to body talk than heterosexual men? Because we know that homosexual men do, but what about for those other men that, you know, like more than one gender and that kind of thing? So just wanted to ask that just to see.
Make for a good study. Anybody have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Sophie's saying probably more than heterosexual, but probably less than homosexual. Yeah.
Yeah, the way I thought about it is so for bisexual men, I think it would really depend on the relationship. Like if they're in a relationship with another man, people would probably assume that they're both gay men, you know, without just looking at them like, oh yeah, those are two men, they're in a relationship, those are gay men. So maybe they might feel more pressure to body talk and fit into that stereotype of a gay man if they're seen as a gay man. Does that make sense? Whereas if they're in a straight relationship, it may, you know, kind of lessen that pressure. It's still there, but it may kind of lessen that pressure to feel like they have to body talk.
I wonder if it's a function too of relationship status, that being in a relationship, a lot of times individuals, if they have really high pressure and high standards for themselves, they kind of relax. But if somebody is dating, and particularly for men who have sex with men who are dating and having multiple partners, my bet would be there'd be a lot more appearance pressure in that kind of situation. Thoughts on that, on relationship status and how that might predict for both men and women?
Definitely think, at least from my own experience, I'm much more relaxed on myself when I'm with a partner, because I feel like they reassure me when I'm like putting too much pressure, whether that's academics or anything else. I think having that support system is very helpful. And I don't know if it's like makes us just more settled in who we are, because you have like that outward support telling you like, I love you as you are and like you're completely fine. And I wonder if that is what lessens the pressure. I definitely have experienced it myself.
And that's some of the age effect that the literature has shown. We think younger women are more likely dating, partnering, that type of thing than middle-aged older women. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? On how relationship status might affect this? Okay, Madison, take it away.
All right. Let's see. Okay, can you see that? Okay, just wanted to make sure. All right, so, well, if I can get my thing to work with me. Okay, Okay, so I have a video. I don't know if you're going to be able to hear it, but it's a podcast type thing. Group of gay men going deeper, and they talk about their body. So we're going to watch like the first 3-ish minutes because I think it's really interesting to hear about from the perspective of a gay man. And let me know if you can hear this.
Can you turn it up? We can hear a teeny bit.
Okay, let's see. That's as far as it goes.
I can't hear anything.
So
No.
if you go up to the bar and press the little 3 dots, then press share audio.
Let's see. Oh, there we go. Okay. Well, thank you.
And going deeper.
Is that better?
I am Michael, and here we have Matt, Callan, and Reno. And we're happy to have you here today again. And today we're talking about body adi adi, everyone's favorite topic, right?
Yeah.
Start off with Callan. Callan, tell us what you have to say about your body.
Oh my God, what don't I have to say about my body? So this is like everything under the sun for the gay community. Like, I don't know about you guys, but for me, being gay and being in the gay community, it has revolved around body and like worshiping body and like being the mask of all masked men and having that Adonis body and looking a certain way and having a certain aesthetic and being a certain height. And like, if you don't fit these categories and check these boxes, you don't fit in, you don't belong. And I hate that. And it drives me crazy, especially since so many of us come with so much baggage. For me, it's been really difficult personally because I grew up not overweight at the beginning, but I did get to about maybe almost 200 pounds when I was about 12, 13, 14. And that was like that time frame when you're kind of, you know, I knew I was gay, but I was really coming to terms with it around that age and fighting against it. And then also being at school, that was like the really impressionable bullying years for me. So I was like the fat, overweight ginger kid who everybody could easily make fun of because I was just like a simple target because I was also clearly gay. And like, so I was just made fun of again and again and again. And it just drilled in this belief system in me that like, okay, I'm not worthy. I'm not worth it. I have no value because of all of these things. As I grew up and started eating healthier and I, you know, got kicked out of my dad's, had to move in with my mom and she ate a lot healthier, my body weight naturally went down and I did, you know, start to grow into myself and I did get a lot taller. And so that helped stretch things out as well. But I've always struggled with this issue of because of who I am, because like was an overweight kid and made fun of for being a redhead, like these personal values of mine didn't develop. And then I joined the gay community and I thought, okay, you know, I can finally be myself. I can finally put myself out there. I can finally just be free to be myself. And to an extent I could, but like everything still revolved around what you looked like aesthetically. And I felt really disheartened because I wanted to connect with people on a genuine level. And it felt like a lot of it was so surface level that it just made me like cringe. I was like, this is gross. Like this takes me back to high school and this is such bullshit. We all had to deal with it in high school. Why the fuck are we dealing with it again now? So I think a lot of the gay community has revolved around that kind of aspect that like we have to look a certain way. You have to have the abs, you have to have the nice chest, you have to have the arms. And then I see all these guys who go out and do it and like kill themselves trying to look a certain way, and they're still not happy, and they're still like driving themselves crazy with like anorexia and bulimia and body dysmorphia. And we don't talk about it in the gay community because nobody wants to admit to it. And it's complete bullshit because I can see it from a mile away.
All right, so I just wanted to share that just to kind of get the perspective of a gay man. And, you know, it's very obvious that gay men have a lot more pressure to body talk. You know, like he said, you have to look aesthetically pleasing and, you know, stereotypically gay men have good fashion sense and that kind of thing. Plus bullying because kids are brutal and, you know, people who, you know, say that they're gay or that kind of thing. they're kind of like easy targets. So just wanted to talk about that a little bit.
He was a good example of some intersectionality too, of, talking about how he felt like he was chubbier as a youngster and carried that with him, even though his body changed.
Mm-hmm.
And then he's got the, he called himself a ginger. He's got the light skin tone that for some individuals is considered to, could be teased because of that. And then you've got the sexual aspect, the sexual orientation aspect. So he, he had a couple of boxes of
Mm-hmm.
feeling like he was the underdog in several ways.
Yeah. So let us. Okay, so the research that is talked about in the book, England et al., 2013, they did a survey of 66 predominantly Caucasian college men from a Midwestern university. Of those men, 75% said they could think of a situation where their male friend was complaining about his body. And 25% of those state that they believe college men do this frequently, which I was actually really surprised by that number because, we know that it happens, but stereotypically you'd think, oh, like men don't really have that much of an issue with how their bodies look, but they really do. And the question here that I wanted to ask is, in what ways does advertising promote body talk in men? Because we talked about it a little bit in women, and we talked about some things with men, but like what types of advertising promotes that in men? Because there are a lot.
I think of all the underwear commercials and things like that, just showing the abs and the six pack. I know that puts a lot of pressure on some men.
Yeah, I would say any personal hygiene product or even cologne, like the Calvin Klein commercials. You see these really attractive ripped men on boats, and I feel like that's a lot of pressure for men as well to look a certain way.
I think also actors, specifically men of color actors, they're expected to be extremely attractive. White men, not as much. Like, there's plenty of examples that we could give that, like, they're not specifically attractive, but they're funny. But I feel like men of color, especially, have a very high standard in actors of being extremely attractive.
Many of you mentioned the dad bod in your reflections. And I think that's a newer expression. But many of you spoke about how it allows for humor and flexibility for like middle-aged men beyond kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think about with advertising, for us women, it's not very subtle. You have like the appetite suppressant lollipops and things like that, the skinny teas. But when you're a man and you're not really paying attention to female advertisements and you're looking at the male ones that are targeted towards you, it may feel like, oh, like, do I really have to look like this? Like, this is all I got, like this is all that I can be. So I thought that was really interesting, and I actually have a couple examples. So we have the cologne advertisements, which makes no sense to me as to why you should have, as to why cologne has anything to do with body shape and size. It's literally just to make you smell good. But then you have like the Abercrombie and Fitch posters that you see in the mall, all over the place. And then the protein powders, recovering muscle, that type of thing, where you're supposed to get a six pack and you're supposed to have these big biceps. And then the one example that I think is really interesting is mannequins, like store mannequins. They're always seen with like the biggest arm muscles. And I actually have an example of my younger brother. He's 12, and we were at Dick's Sporting Goods, and he was just looking around for like some athleisure wear for basketball. And he kept looking at this one shirt, and we were like, well, why don't you get it? And he was like, because I don't look like that guy. And we're like, well, you don't have to look like that guy. He's not real. It's a mannequin. Like, most men do not look like that. Trust me, it is okay. But, you know, it's interesting to think about how young boys even look at something as simple as a mannequin and think, well, I don't look like that, so I can't wear this. So, yeah. And so the next section is family influence on body snarking and body talk. So we have the Newmark Steiner et al. 2010, where they surveyed 365 adolescent girls with a mean age of about 15.8 who were participating in an alternative physical education program called New Moves. And they surveyed them on their body dissatisfaction, weight controlled behaviors, and then binge eating. And from these girls, 50%, which is a large percentage, said that they were encouraged to diet by their mothers. And 2/3 of those reported that their mothers themselves were dieting. And what we found from that is that the mothers dieting and fat talking, as well as encouraging those behaviors, were heavily associated with unhealthy weight control behaviors, as well as binge eating in these girls. And something else that I didn't put on here was the 40% of fathers that also engaged in dieting and fat talk. And even though like the father's behaviors do impact the young girls, it's to a much lesser extent than the mothers. But one question that I wanted to ask that's not on here is, do we think that with sons, do we think that fathers engaging those type of behaviors will encourage them to binge eat and that sort of thing, or is that more of just like a female thing? Because I thought that was really interesting to think about was, you know, do young boys look at their fathers and think, you know, well, he doesn't like his body, so, you know, maybe I should start engaging in these behaviors.
Because our culture tells the girls that this is supposed to be more important for them, I would think the influence might be a little bit stronger on the girls, but I would think it'd be there for the boys too, you know? And isn't
Yeah,
that
I think I see it in my brothers as well, because I'm the oldest of four. I have two younger brothers, and Connor is 16, and my dad is he's overweight. You know, I mean, he has been his whole life, but my parents are always talking about dieting, and so Connor has kind of gotten that into his head that he has to eat less and less and work out more. So he's constantly in his room just working out and doing that kind of thing. And I'm like, Connor, you don't have to do that, but like, you know, you look fine, you know, and it's just that type of thing where it's like, oh, like, you know, my dad says this about his body, so I have to start doing these things.
I think I hear a lot of guys our age, or at least like my close friends, talk about like, oh, like I don't want my body to be let go like my dad. And I feel like I hear those comments from guys our age, being like, oh, I don't want to forget to like exercise or gain a whole bunch of weight like my dad did. So I definitely hear those comments. I definitely don't think it's as common as girls, but I definitely think it's still there.
Yeah. And Sophie put in the chat that it's not just boys and dads too, but many boys also look up to their mothers, which I actually didn't even think about, you know, how you hear like, you know, he's a mama's boy and that kind of thing. So maybe even mothers talking bad about themselves could encourage young boys who look up to their mothers to start doing these behaviors. But if nobody has anything else, I will continue.
Would it encourage them to also criticize other women if they like see their mom doing it, criticize other women for their weight?
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that either. Most likely, which is really sad to think about, but that may be even the starting point for, you know, how middle school boys like to make fun of other middle school girls and that type of behaviors. So most likely, definitely.
I remember hearing my dad, he would oftentimes make commentary, like, you know, an actress on TV or the woman who does the weather or something like that. He would make commentary and kind of judge women based on their attractiveness. And I always would kind of cringe when I would hear that, because it was a message that that's what women are about. And that's not how he behaved around me. I was allowed to be about a lot of other things, but I do remember hearing that and just like, ugh, stop doing that. You know, he wasn't doing that to guys on TV. He was only doing it to the gals.
Yeah.
My dad kind of does the same thing, but not with like people on TV, but like if he goes to a restaurant and he wants to get something at the bar, if he walks in, he sees a male bartender, he'll just walk out. He'll be like, no, I don't want to be served a drink by another male. Like, and it's because he's just really like, he's extremely homophobic. So like any interaction with like a male in any, I don't know, way, social interaction, pretty much, he's just like, no, I don't want to like look at a male as I'm drinking. I want to look at, you know, a female with a nice body or whatever. And even if it's an unattractive female, he'll be like, ugh, no, like, and just leave. And it's just really like just not good.
It reminds me,
Alright.
I have friends who are Catholic, and because at one point in the service they hold hands, the man always has to be on the outer aisle so that he could hold hands with his wife, but wouldn't have to hold hands potentially with another man. It's just like, yeah.
Yeah, very interesting things that a lot of people do in that way. All right, so our next study was Eli Howe, Fisher, and Noaga from 2014, where they interviewed 22 parents and 27 grandparents with children or grandchildren ages 3 to 5. And the two prompts they were given was, did you ever think about your weight when you were a child around 5 to 8 years of age? And at what age, if ever, did you start thinking about your weight? And from the 49 participants, 25 reported that they were very aware of their weight from a young age, which caused a lot of negative feelings and experience associated with that, including binge eating, bulimia, anorexia, that kind of thing. But what I wanted to ask, because it's one of the last sentences at the end of that part of the chapter, was talking about how people want to try to break out of that generational cycle. But what are some ways that we can break out of that cycle of discussing body weight with children and families that is helpful and not harmful and appropriate for children?
I talked about this in like one of my reflections, but my parents always like associated like exercise with just like feeling better, not necessarily like having to like lose weight and look a certain way. But my dad like exercises a lot, and he really kind of emphasized to me that, you know, you should exercise because it makes you feel better like overall and not just to like look a certain way. So
I like that approach. I know I raised my boys with the idea that exercise helps relieve stress. All of us are like borderline ADHD. So exercise helps you concentrate or helps you chill when you need to chill. I like that approach of like other positive benefits. And I think wouldn't the same approach go for healthful eating? You know, we're going to try to pick foods that nourish our bodies, that are good for us, that type of thing.
I think my family definitely emphasized food that makes you feel good rather than like specifically like weight and stuff. But like eating healthy makes you also feel really good versus eating a whole bunch of like crazy or fast foods, like at some point makes you feel bad. And I think my family really tuned in on me being aware of my body and how food made me feel. Like, oh, this makes me feel like energetic, and like, or this makes me feel really tired, that type of stuff.
And then how many of you were raised in sports? And so the exercise and the training was to sharpen your skills or make you stronger, faster, whatever the sport might be. I know Vivian danced, but that's sort of like, here's what you do to keep your body strong and to train and to be able to perform your sport, as opposed to working out to lose weight or working out to control your body, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that not forcing kids to eat everything on their plate. I know that my parents did that when I was younger, and it has created such an unhealthy relationship with food to where like I will binge. But not forcing children to eat every single thing on their plate, and if they don't like something, to not force them to eat that. You know, if a kid doesn't like something, they're not going to eat it. I remember there was one time I was at my grandparents, and my papa was very strict. He's gotten better with age, but when I was younger, there was this time that we were eating dinner at his house, and green beans. I hated green beans when I was younger. Didn't like the smell of them. Didn't like the taste of them. I hated it. And of course, they had made green beans with dinner, and I didn't want to eat them. And he was like, "Well, you have to eat every single one of these green beans if you want to go out and ride your bike." And I was like, I really want to ride my bike, but I don't want to eat these green beans. And he's like, "Well, you have two choices: not ride your bike or eat the green beans." And so I was like, "All right, I'm gonna eat the green beans, but if I throw up later, it's on you." So that's just, you know, some of the examples of things that parents and grandparents should not do. And I
Dr.
think that a lot of parents do that.
Dr. Amy Galloway in our department, we've done a little bit of research together, but I know she's done quite more research on, she looks at how parents pressure kids. So that would be a good example of being pressured to eat a food that you don't like. She also talks about when parents restrict foods. So like, let's say a kid's eating chips out of a bag, going and taking that bag, going, you don't need to be doing that. You don't need to eat the whole bag. That both the pressuring and the restriction tends to backfire and create more eating disorder kind of behaviors in the children than just the alternative to that kind of stuff is to introduce children to different types of food, but allow them to taste and try stuff, but allow them, like in your situation, Madison, knowing you don't like green beans. And it's like, okay, don't serve Madison green beans and don't make her eat green beans kind of thing. So introducing different foods to children, encouraging them to try stuff, but then not pressuring and not restricting. And then those children are more likely to grow up and be intuitive eaters and eat, you know, eat what they want, stop when they're satisfied. I know I was raised on Clean Plate Club, and I had to really work as an adult to be able to leave food behind on my plate, because it felt like, you know, I was doing wrong to the starving children somewhere in the world kind of thing, because that's what I was told growing up, and had to kind of work at that. And then was very deliberate about that with my boys too, and not pressuring them to eat when they really didn't want to eat. But it took, I mean, it took work. like it didn't come naturally, you know, if you're raised a certain way. Anybody else kind of raised in those kinds of ways? Either or, pressure, restriction, clean your plate.
Yeah, my grandpa, he was very much the same way because his family had 10 children, and you know, they had to scrape together all their food to feed everyone. So he's like, you know, you should be appreciative of the food that you have, you should eat it and everything. And I'm very picky, and I always have been. And so, you know, he would get really annoyed that I didn't want to eat it. And my grandma would be like, let me just eat it for you. Or like, you know, I'll put it back, you know. So it was like this extreme dynamic just between the both of them in the same room at the same table. I'd be like, no, I don't want to. My grandpa's like, no, you have to. My grandma's like, no, it's fine, you don't have to. And then she would be the one like serving it, you know, and cooking most of the time. And so usually if she was making like a dish where I didn't like something in it, like she had chicken fried steak, she would put onions on it, and I didn't like onions, and so she would not serve onions on my plate, and she would just give it to them instead. So they found workarounds, but sometimes she would forget, or it'd be something else that I wouldn't be willing to try, and then it would just be this whole thing. So it was very like back and forth.
Yeah, I think I've seen a dramatic shift in parenting as well, with our generation, and trying to promote the intuitive eating habits and things like that. And I actually have a slide on parenting styles because I thought that would be interesting to add. So here we have Red Foreman. from that 70s show. He is very much an authoritarian type parent, very high standards and expectations, very strict, super controlling, a lot of rules, you know, and if you don't follow the rules, he'll stick his foot up your ass. And then you have the authoritative parent who has that sort of parental warmth, with very clear boundaries and, you know, knows how to punish when those boundaries aren't being met, but also use of positive reinforcement. And then you have the permissive parents who don't really have any clear boundaries / no boundaries at all. And they're typically seen as the friend parent who sees their kid as more of like a buddy than, you know, their child. But something that I wanted to ask was, you know, which of these parenting styles might promote or encourage more of those unhealthy relationships with food and exercise, as well as promote more fat talk? Because, you know, I think we know that there are a lot of different parents out there, and even with a good parenting style, you know, kids still will, you know, bullying and that type of stuff will still engage in fat talk. But I just wanted to ask, you know, which parenting style do you think would promote more of that?
Makes sense to me that the authoritarian, the really strict and rigid, would backfire. And when you think about, for some individuals with eating disorders, the most basic of life control that individuals have is what they put in their mouth and eat, and what they don't put in their mouth and eat. And so it makes sense that that control gets played out in that way for some individuals if they're living in an environment where there's all that rigidity and that strictness and the rules, and don't violate the rules and all that kind of stuff. But any thoughts on the permissive? I'm curious if anybody had any thoughts about that.
I think that permissive parents might not even recognize those behaviors in their children, because a lot of them don't really pay attention to their children in ways that they should be. So, you know, their children are struggling and maybe they don't even realize it. And they're not doing anything to help those behaviors. So, you know, it's really just kind of like a lose-lose situation and that sort of thing. I definitely agree. I think authoritarian, you know, like you said, the only control you have over is what you put in your body. And so, you know, I think with that, there may be more binge eating. It just makes sense to me that having control over what you eat, but then also not, in some sort of ways, would make sense. So yeah.
I do know one family that they're quite permissive, and one of the little girls eats like Lucky Charms every morning for breakfast. But I've had dinner with them, and it makes me kind of cringe inside as a mom, where if they serve something for dinner that she doesn't like, she goes and gets the Lucky Charms. And it's just like, you know, like, yeah, Lucky Charms are okay occasionally, but that's, you know, not a good staple food, you know, and it's just like, yeah.
Yeah, I see that a lot with my parents, with my sister. They were a lot more restrictive with me and my brothers, whereas my sister, they're just like, yeah, you can have anything you want, you know, it's fine. You're our fourth kid, you know, you'll do fine just like the other ones, and that sort of thing. So I think parents who have more than one children, and there's even a study on like the siblings, but yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah. And that's pretty typical with multiple children, Madison, to be stricter on the firstborn and more lenient as they move along. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, if nobody has anything else, I think I only have one slide left. So this is the partner influence. And so the study that was in this section was the Bovenson Ball in 2011, where they studied 20 women and 14 men prior to marriage and then a year later. And they categorized the fat talk in certain ways. So there's pragmatic weight talk, which is more of like matter of fact discussion. So like we're trying to cut back on sweets, which was the example that they gave in the book. And then active reinsurance, which is the focus on weight from an appearance perspective. And then tacit reinsurance, where one spouse gains weight and the other either isn't concerned by it or just fails to bring it up. Complaining criticism, where a spouse who gains weight is actively fat talking. And then critiquing criticism, where a partner complains about the other's weight gain. And the question that I'm really interested in is, what are some examples of critiquing criticism in modern media? Because there's a lot where one partner complains about the other's weight gain. And how do you think it might affect someone to see that type of relationship in movies and shows and that sort of thing?
I was watching a show with my dad last night. I forget the name of it. We were kind of like half watching it, but I remember there was a scene, it was like a medieval show, and there was a scene where like it was wintertime and one of the characters said, "The pigs are fattening up nicely." And then the other guy said, "Yeah, well, so is my wife." And I was like, I did a double take, and like no one else in my family thought it was weird. But I was like, why was that? That's not, why would you say it? Like, why? There was no reason for a character to say that other than like, haha, funny joke about women's weight. So it's definitely more prevalent than I thought it was, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're sensitive to it now, Vivian. Y'all aren't going to be able to unsee this stuff anymore. Can you think of any other examples, any other TV shows or movies where that's been the case?
I know in a lot of movies and TV shows I see, there's always like the one scene where the man will kind of like playfully nudge his wife or a girlfriend or whatever, be like, "You put on a few pounds," and it's like, don't say that. Just don't say that. You know, seeing someone in media say like, "Oh, you put on a few pounds," and it's always a skinnier woman who doesn't even really look, that heavy set. And it's just kind of like, okay, that's nice. you know.
Yeah,
I've definitely
go ahead.
I've definitely seen it in real life with like wives commenting on their husband's weight gain too, being like, "Oh, he's putting on some pounds," or "Oh, he's getting that beer belly," or that type of stuff. I've seen those comments and I think they're detrimental too.
Yeah. Any other thoughts, comments? Anybody? Do we have a sense of who the fat talkers are now? We definitely need more research on race in this area, and we need more, I feel like, on LGBTQ individuals. There's not much on that in the literature. I liked your question about the bisexuality. We haven't looked at that. So it's kind of wide open in taking a look at this. And then we really don't know in terms of research, other than Mimi Nichter's work on the middle school individuals, how early this stuff starts. Like how young are children beginning to fat talk, as well as we do have a sense of how young children are when they start snarking and they start teasing other people, but not so much when they're actually participating in the fat talk. So kind of ripe area for some more research on that stuff. Okay. Well, thank you, Allison. Thank you, Madison. And we've got 2 more presentations coming up on Thursday. Okay. Good to see everybody. Y'all take care.